to the philosophy panel. This is going to be a discussion of personal identity, whether or not we know if our brains are to be trusted, whether or not we can trust our perceptions. Maybe we're all just computers. That's the kind of ideas we're planning on discussing. I'm Jarrod. I'm going to be moderating this discussion. I am a member of the Dialectic Society, a society based around discussions of interesting ideas, debating different concepts, be it arts, be it politics, be it philosophy. We host various events throughout the semesters while people are, well, I guess digitally on campus at this time of year. But normally they are more in person and they are more less streamed, more in person. Moving on, I'm going to introduce the panelists that will be discussing the philosophy that we have in front of us with us. They are from the Philosophy Thought's podcast. I will let them introduce themselves though.
Hi, I'm Jasmine.
Hello, I'm Keir, and me and Jasmine are hosts of the Philosophy podcast.
And the podcast started around, I think it was July of last year, so we're a wee babby, and it's a huge group of us just getting together, interviewing people, putting good content out there, and it's a really fun project to do.
Mm-hmm. We try and have discussions about contemporarily important philosophy or just philosophy we're interested in, and we'll reach out to academics and philosophers and interesting people from Glasgow and Scotland and the UK and the world and get them on the show for to talk with them.
I'm also from Thought's. My name's Adam, and I'm the transcript writer. So I write them up afterwards. I have a PhD, I should say that. That's why I'm here.
Humble brags aside, we're going to delve right into the philosophy. The first thought experiment that we have in front of us is arguably the most well-known, but also probably the most interesting. And that is the case of the brain in the vat. Best known from its use in The Matrix, the brain in the vat case questions whether or not we could ever actually understand anything about the world outside of our head. Are the ways in which that I see the world with my eyes something that can be trusted? Is the fact that I feel this table, this laptop, something that is proof that that actually exists? Are we all actually people? Are we fundamentally human, or is there potential that we are actually just brains sitting in jars, a la Futurama, but with less of the faces? We'll go straight to Keir for thoughts on this one.
So you can kind of break this thought experiment down into stages. So first off, you say, like, what do we know about the world? What are we sure that we can obtain knowledge about? And it'll be, what I can see, what I can taste and feel and hear. But then you question, well, what about, seen an optical illusion? Like, have your eyes ever lied to you? And if they have, even once, then maybe we can't trust them. So we have to take away all sensorial input as a trusted way to obtain true knowledge about the world around us. Then you break it down and be like, what about when you're dreaming? You wake up in the morning and you go and get your shower and you get dressed and you're ready, and then you wake up again and you realize that was all just in your head. And so if you can dream any of these things, anything that you could dream about, it's not a valid thing to say that you can obtain true knowledge about. And then finally, the most interesting step, I think, about the brain in the vat thought experiment is the logic. You never dream that 2 + 2 = 3. Yeah, it just doesn't happen. Logic will still stand. But when you're pushing it, you can actually, Descartes comes up with this idea of an evil demon, which is basically a bloke who gets off on you making basic missteps in logical reasoning. So if I go 1 + 1, he sparks my brain, and I go, that's 2, when it's actually not. And so you get to the point where you can't trust anything. And what the brain in the vat experiment says is, we could just be brains that are being stimulated by an evil demon or just by a supercomputer, that anytime we think we're doing something, there's a feedback loop and the supercomputer feeds us in this fake reality, basically what happens in the Matrix. And the problem is that not that we're really going to be brains in a vat, but that we can't actually know if we're brains in a vat or not. We can never tell the difference. So can we ever really obtain knowledge about the world outside ourselves.
So I think the main question that I have for you then is, why is the possibility of these things being, possibility of sometimes being deceived enough for us to start doubting everything? Like, yes, I've seen optical illusions, and I know that they're not real and that isn't, like, true, but it seems more intuitive that, like, we're not always being tricked, surely.
I think that you would want to say that and grasp on to the fact that you're right, I'm not always being tricked. And I agree with you. I ain't trying to push this agenda, but it's if you are even agree that sometimes you can be tricked, then when can you ever truly say that you're not being tricked? And you end up in this position where there's no way to really obtain knowledge about the world. It is a bit one of these philosophical fantasies why people think philosophers just speak nonsense all the time, and they might be half right or they might be half wrong, because we can't tell.
Would either of the other panelists like to chime in on this one?
Do you want to go first, Liz?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to consider, because if there is nothing, if we can't really trust anything, then you kind of, I think intuitively you kind of get this idea of, it's like, well, what is the point in doing anything? Like, what's the point of following societal rules? What's the point of not breaking the law? And so it raises a lot of questions, which is why it's a really interesting, important thing to think about, I think.
I mean, there's two sort of side considerations that it brings up. One of them is more to do with personal identity. The other one is something that comes up in the limitation of the doubt. So you said before, isn't it more intuitive to think that the world's actually there? Well, doubt itself, you can argue, actually does have a limit. There's only so much you can doubt. And that comes back into the brain in the jar thing, which is, if you imagine a doubt as being, you're saying, it is neither true nor false that I am a brain in the jar, right? You're not saying whether it is true or not. You're not saying it's false. You have no opinion on it whatsoever. You probably can't actually doubt that doubt, though, which sounds odd. You maybe think to yourself, well, I can, but think of it this way. If doubting is the action of saying it is neither true nor false, that, in the statement that follows it, if you try to say it is neither true nor false, that it is neither true nor false that I think I'm a brain in the jar, you actually can't doubt your own doubt. You can only doubt once with regards to your own. So you can doubt as many propositions about the world as you want, but you find it very difficult to coherently doubt yourself doubting. So that would be, to bring it back to the history, I suppose, it's roughly what Descartes is getting at when he says that he doesn't talk about a brain in the jar, but he does say, I am a thinking thing. I think, therefore I am. And that's because that thing that he can't doubt is that he is the thing that's doubting.
So, yeah, that was what I was going to discuss next, is even if the world around me is fake, even if we do live in a kind of Matrix-style simulation, surely I can be at least sure that I exist internally. If I like think about things and I like say I just like think about myself, I surely can therefore infer from that idea that at minimum, at least I exist. I am at least that brain in that. And surely there is at least something to be said that you can never say deny your own existence. What would you think on that?
I think you're bang on right. You can't deny your own existence. I think, therefore I am, as Adam put it, but, well, not originally, it was Descartes originally, but as Adam...
I'll take credit, that's fine, it's my idea.
As Adam said there, the thing is that enough for you, Jarrod? Are you happy to be like, well, I'm a brain in a vat, at least I know I exist? Is that enough for you to live the rest of your life knowing that? Because that's where the fear and the doubt comes in, that if you get too philosophical, get too skeptical, become a global skeptic about everything, that it's difficult to get much done.
So, even if we are in the kind of Matrix simulation, surely there is still value to be had in that existence within the simulation, right? because I still have like the ability to enjoy myself. Maybe my memories are fake, but I feel happy thinking about them, even if they are fake. So what is, in terms of the more, in the bigger question around this, what is the kind of consequences of us thinking about whether or not we live in a simulation? How should this affect how we act?
Well, there's a couple of different questions sort of contained within that question. So with regards to whether or not you could actually have value of a life lived in simulation, you could, but that's just because the manner by which we afford meaning and value to our lives is subtly distinct from how we know that that life is true or not. You could tie them together, but it is perfectly possible. I mean, people enjoy fiction. They see value in fiction, but they know quite explicitly that it's not true. The truth value of fiction is not where it derives its value from. But with regards to why it's important to consider these issues, it's like the very abstract end of something that is actually far more practical to our daily concerns, which is just how you believe and trust what people tell you, things like that. Particularly if you think about it in terms of testimony, it works that way. How can you trust what someone tells you happened if you can't even trust yourself first and foremost? So that would be maybe how you would begin to evaluate it in terms of how important it is to consider these decidedly abstract matters.
Jarrod, I'd also like to jump on something somewhat tangential to this thought experiment, but while we're at fun thought experiments, why not go there? And you said that the value of your pleasures, even though you're in a simulation, because it rang true to me as Nozak's pleasure machine, where Nozak questioned whether if you could go in a simulation and you would live your same life, but just that little bit better, like everything you wanted to achieve, you just would, and there was just more pleasure in that life, and you'd forget everything that had happened to you, but you would live an overall more pleasurable life. Would you do it? Would you step into the simulation? And sometimes people's instinct is to be like, no, I don't want to step in the simulation, even if it is more pleasurable than my regular life. And so, as you said, it was okay to be the brain in the vat because, you know, I'm still getting those pleasures. But is it okay? Do you really believe that?
And there's an interesting sort of sub-point to that as well, which is that Nozick's whole idea is that, yeah, it will be a more pleasurable life. One could argue, I'm not sure how much you could get out of it, you could argue that pleasures are directly associated to pains, so that a pleasure is perceived to be better than it is by virtue of past memory of what the opposite's like. For instance, if you go through a particular period of hardship, something that's a fairly simple pleasure that you might not consider as being outrageously amazing, you know, pleasure machine levels of pleasure is in fact, you know, almost transcendent. And think of like, well, I once fasted for charity for 30 days. I can assure you the first during the day meal was amazing, and it was nothing special. It's like a rolling sausage, but God, it was amazing. Can't go wrong with Lorne though. That's all philosophers agree.
Truth University acknowledged.
Jasmine, do you want to chime in on this before I ask the next question?
I mean, I don't think I have anything much more to add other than that. I think it's quite an easy thing to sort of accept that you're, or maybe it's plausible to think that you're a brain in a vat, but then like, if everyone thinks that, what implications does that have? If everyone doesn't really, if you're doubting everything except your own existence, but everyone is thinking that, then like, where does that leave you?
I would, yeah, it reminds me of David Hume sort of points this out. He says that it's all well and good, you can argue this, but you'll never really convince yourself, never mind anyone else, that no one else exists. Yeah. It's a very difficult position to actually fundamentally, sincerely hold. You can play around with it. And you probably could push back on it. have a go. With regards to, let's say you're a brain in a jar, you don't know it, everything's been simulated. Well, Descartes and the mob would think that you could prove that Descartes and the mob is a new band.
Good band name, actually. If I have a band, I want that to be the name.
Absolutely. But they would say that you can prove that you're a thinking thing, that your body is not necessary to who you are. You are the thing that thinks. I would argue that you can go a wee bit further than that. Not much further, but further enough to get going, which is that if you can disbelieve every instance of sight, so every single sight you've ever had, you can say it wasn't true, you didn't see it. That does not necessarily entail you can doubt sight in general, that sight doesn't exist. So even though every particular instance of sight you have had is a hallucination, it doesn't necessarily logically entail that sight itself as a general capacity is not real. Think of it in terms of, you could think of every single sight you'd ever had as a verb. You could say, as a noun. You could say, I have had this sight, and here's the sight. But the actual verb of seeing, the doing, the process, doesn't entail just because every single seeing process you've had has been a hallucination that you can't see, or that seeing doesn't exist. And that would go for any other sensory perception you could have. You could doubt every instance, but whether the actual process is doubtable is a different question.
So I'm going to quickly deviate from my laundry list of questions, because we got a question from the audience via the Slido. Quick plug, the Slido is on the events page. You should all go and ask questions if you have any interest in the conversations that we have going. So the question we have from the audience is, how would we actually define reality then? And I think that this does go along a very interesting line, and that if from the moment that I've started to exist, I've existed in a simulation, I've existed within the matrix, why is that not what reality is? What can we really describe as reality at that point then?
Who wants to take it?
I'm sure you'll probably have something more profound. But to me, that sounds like almost like a linguistic debate. Like, would it be possible to refer to the reality we're currently experiencing in this simulation as reality one, and perhaps there is a second reality which has our brains in a vat, or my brain in a vat? Would there be a problem in that? It's more of a question than a statement, because as a host, I'm used to asking the questions. But yeah, like, maybe it's more of a linguistic claim, or maybe I'm choosing to think of it so I can avoid the metaphysics of it.
So you could think of it in terms of, I'm going to self-footnote. It's a paper by Quine called What Is There?, which is quite direct in terms of what it's about. It's about what there is. So if you think of reality as the totality of everything that actually exists. So if you want to think of that in the most fundamental sort of simple way, it's just everything that there absolutely is in the world. Anything that isn't there does not exist. So whether or not you are a brain in a jar, if you say that that's the objective reality, and really the question is basically saying, how can you know what the objective reality is if you can't trust your perceptions? Because you wouldn't be able to identify what was real and what wasn't. Whether that is actually asking what is real and what isn't is maybe debatable, but it's easy just to think of it in that logical sense of reality is everything that there is, but your perceptions do not necessarily tell you what there is. That's where philosophers have went right off the beaten track.
Keir, any contributions?
Nothing more. I think Adam's perfectly summed it up with, everything that ontologically exists is reality. I can't give you much more than that.
Definitely using that in a CV.
if I was born with a virtual reality headset on, and that'd
Yes,
be
you are.
kid coming out of the womb just with like a headset on. I mean, freaky, but quite cool. And my only experience of reality was this virtual reality. How do you think you could then define? Because surely that would be one version of reality, and it exists, and we call it virtual reality. But
No,
is that encompassed
no, I would say, well,
definition?
if you go with that, the actual question of what is reality doesn't change for the baby that comes out of the womb and the baby that comes out of the womb with a virtual reality. Their descriptions of what reality would be do change, but what reality actually is still is just everything that there is. And if you argue, we'll put it this way, it's sort of sliding into the question of, do fictions exist?
Yeah.
What's known as a minefield that we dare not tread this evening for time constraints.
Before we move on, Jarrod, because I can see you wanting to do so, little side note for interesting for the viewers is there actually are chickens in Denmark now which are born with VR headsets on, and for their whole life they're played like free range chicken views, and the ethics is like they live a free range life by this perception, and are they free range chickens? Not here to answer it, just out to the audience.
I think there are definitely interesting questions to be asked about what kind of impact that has on, say, the animal's life expectancy. Because chickens do live better free range. They live for longer. They experience like less like problems in terms of like diseases. I know this because my friend owns chickens. It's a very, very weird bit of knowledge to bring to this panel.
So I live in the country. There's chickens all about. I'm with you.
In any case, the next question that I would like to bring, aside from the nuanced discussion on the nature of how chickens work, is to move on to the next thought experiment. So we've discussed whether or not we ourselves are the reality around us, whether or not we internally are existing within reality or within, say, the Matrix. The next question I'd like to bring up is whether or not our brain is any sort of fundamentally distinct entity from just a computer. Because I think a lot of the time, especially when we're looking at things like AI, Google developing not really robots, but like programs that are capable of talking to each other, capable of like trying to at least think for themselves, you end up wondering how they're doing that. And a lot of it is based on biology and based on trying to like simulate how that works. So the question I then have is our brain any sort of distinct entity from a computer? Are we just computers but made out of like lumps of flesh rather than like some sort of distinct entity from that?
Fleshy Max, that's all I wanted to say, and I'll let one of them take off with it. You either use want to jump in, and then I'll argue my strong position later about how computers can think.
So I think it's a good idea to sort of distinguish between like brain and mind, because there's quite a big debate around that. So like physicalists would say that, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I'm pretty sure they'd say that your brain is your mind basically, and all of your thoughts are basically just neurons firing, and it's a mixture of that and emotions and stuff like that, and it's purely a physical thing. So is the question, is your mind a computer?
Yeah, and some physicists go even further. They say that only that which can be described by the apparatus of modern physics is real. The things that you experience as your mind, your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, and things like that, strictly speaking, don't exist because they can't be described using physics presently. That's a very strong version of that opinion, but the other mob would say that your brain, functionalists, computational functionalists would say that your brain operates basically the same way as a computer. It receives inputs and gives the correct outputs.
I jump in with a quick distinction about when we are talking about minds. There's a distinction for humans, like the brain versus the mind, but also within computers. Like, what do we mean by minds? Like AI is the artificial intelligence is what you go to, but there's like a weak and a strong version of that. So your weak version is that there is a computer which is basically like a mind. It's programmed to work just like a mind, and it can do all the computations and probably more that any mind could do. And then there's strong AI on the other side, which is saying that this is a mind, and this is not like a mind. It absolutely is a thinking, existing ontological unit that is a mind in a way that we have minds. If it works differently, it is a mind in itself. And so we have to think about, like, is our mind just like a AI strong, like a strong AI mind? And like make that connection with the question itself.
Yep. And if you want to introduce sort of two major, well, one's not really a thought experiment, one's just an idea, and then the next one's a thought experiment to sort of frame it. If you've got Alan Turing's imitation game, it's basically a test for whether a thing has a mind or not. It's two participants, one of them's the thing that you're testing, the other one's asking questions. He actually doesn't give a time frame. He sort of suggests it's like a couple of minutes. Could probably be more in depth than that, you'd like to think. That basically you ask questions to the subject, and if they can give you the appropriate responses, eventually you can basically say, yeah, after enough appropriate responses received back, you could say, yes, that thing has a mind. It can think. It can respond intelligently to me. Therefore, it is a mind. And that's sort of where the functionalist version of the mind comes in, because they say that we can do that. And then you've got the Chinese room, which is, I suppose, do you want to, Mr. Moderator, would you like to bring that up?
So before we move on to the Chinese room, I'd just like to ask, maybe this is a question more based in science than it is philosophy, but we don't have full-on understandings of exactly how minds work. I think it was like only 30 years ago wherein we thought that like a thought was like a specific type of neuron firing off and like lighting up, and then that was later found out to be completely wrong, and we just had absolutely no clue. So would you say that the developments that happen in places like compute AI research would be a useful place to explore how the brain works, or do you think those things need to be done in isolation because of the potential differences that could exist between the mind and the computer?
They're always sympathetic to one another. I mean, why they thought particularly neurons were thoughts is just you look at the history of ideas. It happens time and time again. Somebody comes up with a good idea. It works for quite a broad series of cases. So they will run with it until eventually they run up with a couple of cases that it doesn't work, and then they have to review. So eventually, when they were sort of the early days of cognitive neuroscience, they sort of went, oh, good, we can answer all the questions this way. And then it eventually becomes sort of debatable of, can you? The question of, can you, always comes back more or less later. I think if there's a really good book about AI called Artificial Intelligence by Melanie, I'll go get it later. But she writes about winters and springs. AI has lots of springs where there's a lot of funding. They think they can solve it, they can crack it, they can push it on. And then it has the inevitable winter when they realize that the type of AI they've developed can only do so many things, so they have to kind of push it backwards and forwards. And the same kind of goes in general. So yeah, if you want to think about minds, good place to start. Probably, I mean, controversially, with the philosophy. Just because, it's a wee bit broader in scope. You can sort of entertain the questions, and then if you feel you need some more empirical facts, you can go out and get that to support your argument.
Yeah. So to introduce the aforementioned Chinese room experiment. This is a way of thinking about minds to say that they can or cannot be, they could be interpreted in various ways, but it's a way of it's a thought experiment that is meant to work as a way to make you think about whether or not brains do just function the same way as computers. The idea behind it is that there is a room with a small hatch. Inside this room, there is a person with a big rule book which contains Chinese symbols and the answers to give all of the different possible symbols or symbol combinations. People write in Chinese sentences on notes and place them in the hatch. The person inside then uses the rule book to transcribe those symbols to the relevant language and then pushes them back through. The person never has any sort of interaction with the outside world, no way of communicating with an actual Chinese person that is fluent in the language. They themselves have no understanding of the language beyond what they can get from the rulebook. To the person outside of the Chinese room would seem like a mind, though. It could feasibly pass what's known as the Turing test, wherein if a computer can seem like a mind then, or seem like an actual person, respond just as a normal person would, then it must be an actual person that has a mind. However, the question does arise if the person inside not having any sort of actual understanding of the Chinese language, i.e. if you were to go have a conversation with them in Chinese, they just stare at you blankly like, right, wasn't prepared for this one. They don't know what they're saying or doing. They're just following a procedure in the same way that computers follow code. What would the thoughts on this one be? We'll go to Jasmine first.
I think intuitively, if you're just going based off your intuitions, which I think is always a really good place to start, is that you with something sort of as simple as language, well, I say as simple as language, but with something which is very functional and they've got their rule book there, does it matter if that's not a person you're talking to, if it's not a real thinking thing? Yeah, again, I'm just posing more questions, which I'm hoping Adam's going to answer. But yeah, I think it just raises more questions.
I mean, in terms of that one, briefly, do you mean, does it matter to the person outside the room? Do you mean, do they care really whether there's a mind inside?
Both.
Because I'd say the person outside the room, that's a different thing. That's whether or not the receiver understands what's happening, but they do, because they know what the symbols mean. So that's why they have value in that, because they can understand the meaning. The person inside is questionable. I mean, if you've ever worked in a call centre like myself, you would know that a meaningless job certainly does, shuffling symbols about can drag. But that's probably where it would come down to. The person inside the room would be utterly baffled day in, day out. The way that they would, meaning is so intrinsically attached to how we value things. So without the absence of meaning, we find it very difficult to value things.
I think I'd jump in on this one and say that the person inside the room doesn't speak Chinese. They're not a mind in the same way that we think of it. But I kind of think that this experiment the thought experiment a little bit is being too focused and being like, oh, this person doesn't speak Chinese, because like the system as a whole, really, the book that they've got, the Chinese symbols, the in and out, passing the letter through the letterbox to the person reading it on the outside, that system as a whole effectively does speak Chinese. And the human brain, it's not like it doesn't like carry intelligence, it causes it. And I think the analogy is that the person in the room causes an understanding of Chinese to arise, even though it doesn't understand Chinese itself. And I think that that's why there is like value in the system as a whole being considered as a mind, rather than just a computer that's going through a systematic process. If that makes sense.
You see, John Searle, who came up with this, was arguing against strong AI. Now, I think he sort of gets it. I think for perfectly honest, I think it's a bit disingenuous, this whole thoughts experiment, because his idea is that if you want to take the metaphor forward, the room is like your body, and your mind is the wee man inside that's got his rule book, right? But let's change it ever so slightly, because there's one thing that Chinese room can do that people can do, or arguably your mind could. Person inside the Chinese room can never see outside to look at the response of the person that they've given it to. Whereas that's how we learn language. We use it, we can gauge the responses of the people that have, we've given it to, so to speak. And if it's a good response, we kind of go with that. And if it's a bad response, we don't. So if you change it slightly, let's imagine the Chinese room has just below the hatch, there's one of those wee one-way mirrors that you see in films and interrogation rooms. So the person inside the Chinese room can now see out, but the person on the outside can't see in. And let's say he has no rule book, he just has a blank pad of paper. Well, when the first note comes through in Chinese, of course he's going to be utterly baffled. What's he going to write in his notes to send back? I have no idea. But he will write down, as he goes along, all the notes he receives. And he'll write down all the notes that he writes back out. And then he'll note whether or not they had a good response or a bad. I put it to you that after years, the person inside the Chinese room eventually would understand to the same degree as any learner Chinese, because they would eventually have developed their own rule book by virtue of assessing the responses to the responses that they gave. So that's why I think locking the mind inside the Chinese room sort of presents minds in a way that they don't really present, because they can always look at the world beyond them, or at least their perceptions of the world, if you want to go with the last bit, and attenuate their responses based on that. So
would you then say that having a mind is just the process of doing two things, not a process, it's poor wording, just having two things, like the ability to memorize information and the ability to process that information? Because that's all this person in the room is doing. Is that all that is sufficient to actually have a mind then? Because computers can do both of those things.
I'm going to pass this to the other two, because then I've got a position that will be difficult.
So is that to say then that to have a mind is purely to have the function of having an input of information, processing it, and then outputting it in a way where others understand it?
Yes, but also the ability to understand it internally, right? Because that's what happens with the Chinese room. This person eventually inside the room is capable of memorizing Chinese to the extent where they could be considered fluent. Is that all that is needed to be considered to have a mind? Because that is something that computers can do, albeit significantly faster than humans can.
Do computers understand it though?
Yeah, that's the question.
Because if they can pick up patterns, like a child could pick up patterns and notice similarities and stuff like that, but they might fully not understand. I mean, I do this in a seminar. I can understand links between theories, and I can understand, or I can see links between theories. I can see patterns in thought, but I might not fully understand the topic.
I mean, my problem with it is I don't really like the word mind, because I'm not sure. Don't mind thinking, because thinking is a process. But what is a mind? I don't really know. I think it's a sort of pointless term that we stick on it because it's easier. I think mind just really is the name we have for the collection of processes that we can perform. What you really mean is ultimately your mind a computational thing? Is it something that inputs and outputs? On a very basic level, it probably is. Question is, does it do something a wee bit more than that? In terms of creative processes, potentially, because if you're experimenting, you're sort of heading on out to do something, you're playing around, but you have no clear idea of what the output is going to be. Whereas input output on a very mechanical basis, the input would determine what the output is. But we seem to be able to perform processes whereby we're not sure what the output is going to be, and it would be odd to say that we are purely computational if we can do that.
So before we move on to the next thought experiment, it's maybe worth talking a bit about Google, because Google have created AI that are capable of talking to each other, and they created a language that is not only not human, nothing that we have ever created, it is so distinctly complex that the people that made the AI have zero idea what the AI were saying to each other. They could have been plotting our doom. They could have been talking about whether or not you should put milk or water first when you're making a cup of tea. Surely that's something creative that they probably weren't sure about the input that they had originally. This, of course, being they having that idea would, of course, being contingent on the idea that they have minds. But surely that's an example of where computers are doing that. And so those kind of processes that our minds have are also potentially computational.
I mean, I would argue it's not creative, what they're doing. Which is just really, I mean, they come up with a language, but the question is developing a language creative? Well, it's a social activity. There could be a distinction between those two. I'm afraid not yet far enough through my PhD research to tell you about creativity. Right, I've not done that yet. But with regards to language, I had an idea and it's gone. You see, the input has left. I don't know. Clearly, I must be some sort of mind. I'll come back to me. I've totally forgotten what I was saying.
Do either of the other panelists have anything to say before I go to an audience question?
Yeah, go to an audience question. Why
Yeah,
not?
because I can't remember. I'm blank.
So this is potentially quite this is the note I'd like to end the discussion on, because I think this is quite a big how this applies in real world kind of question. Is like, do we think that AI would create, like, say AI were capable of in some way creating some sort of society? Do we think that the AI would create a similar society to the types that we have in the human world, or do we think it would be something entirely new and original that we had never seen before? And furthermore, I think this is definitely a bit of a like jump from that previous question, but should we be worried about things like AI rights, whether or not they will perceive us as inferior, or whether or not they will be perceived as inferior themselves?
In Elon Musk's podcast with Joe Rogan, there's a bit where he like went to the UN and said like we need to talk about the rights of AIs. Like we need to do it. And it's like 2008 or something. He's like, we need to do it. Like what rights will they have? And the UN was like, wow, that's ridiculous. They're computers. And there's this really terrifying moment where he's like, I tried, and now it's too late. And I think that we do need to worry about the rights of AIs and whether they will look at us as inferior beings when they come, because I think it's very likely to do so. But I have no more qualifications to say what those rights ought to be.
I mean, my response massages the egos of philosophers all around the world, so they will. I will be thanked for that. Quite a lot of the worries about AI and things like that, whether they would have societies and things like that, are anthropomorphizing AI to a point. So ask yourself, why do human beings set up societies? Physical weakness, but also the innate desire we have to be social. We're very social animals. There's no reason to suppose that an AI would have any desire to be social, and therefore why would it set up a society? Yeah, I mean, lots of these things just don't necessarily follow. And the other question would be, if they ran up to it, they would eventually run up to philosophical problems that we haven't solved, and there's really no suggestion that they would be any better at solving them. If you asked an AI, what let's say you've got the age-old Skynet's just hovering over the old nuclear button, because I'm going to exterminate humanity. You say, well, why? eventually, if you asked it why long enough, it would run up to a question of like, oh, I wouldn't know, because eventually there's value problems that seem to be incredibly difficult, and it would be questionable to what degree an AI would be able to answer them. And actually, when AI does make mistakes, if you look at the history, it tends to not like them at all. It doesn't know what to do. It goes like, unlike us, where we can just sort of go, I'll patch that and come back to it. It's a bit, I've run up, oh geez, I can't do that. They tend to hang. Your programs crash. I mean, think of it that way.
When AI has discomfort, like that, how does it present itself? Does it literally just crash, or is it just there, sort of like, like what happens?
I mean, that's sort of what happens when a software program crashes. It's encountered a problem and it doesn't know how to do it, so it
because like
crashes.
Would it be possible then if like if you, like, for example, like with sex dolls, if they're sophisticated enough to have discomfort, you would run into a lot of like issues of rights there. But if it's technological, would it be possible, if it's like if they are purely technology, would it be possible to just sort of like wipe the hard drive and start again, and so they don't remember that discomfort? And then again, obviously, is that ethical, or is it actually a mercy? Like,
anyone want to put themselves in the chair as the sex doll expert at the present time?
For employability reasons, I think I'll prevent all of you from putting yourself in the chair.
User manual says, I think.
I'll just go and
I'll move us swiftly on with safe in the knowledge that if there's ever an AI army coming at my door, the way to solve them is ask them if the chicken came before the egg.
No, we've got an answer to that. You should look it up. Raging. Someone found it out.
So
what
the next.
No, I'm going to tell you. I can't. You know what? Annoyingly, I can't quite remember. But basically, they figured it out. I think it was like an evolutionary biologist found out that, I think it's the animal that eventually would hatch eggs would have to come first, because it would then have to lay the egg. There's no way to suppose that it necessarily was in an egg prior to it laying eggs. You know what? Look it up. Google it.
That's for another panel session.
That's a different panel. That's our sex dolls and egg panel, please.
For the next question, then, I think it's a question of whether or not we are the same person for our lives. What we're going to be talking about is a very high sci-fi idea, but I think it's worth investigating. And that is the idea of transportation technology. Imagine, if you will, that a transportation machine which scans every single subatom that exists of you, disassembles all of your atoms, and then reassembles them in a different location into the exact same identical structure that it scanned beforehand. That means that there is a period of time where physically on an atomic level, you kind of stop existing. And given that most people buy the idea that the brain is what has some sort of connection to the mind, that means that mentally you also kind of stop existing for a period of time. Does that mean that there are questions to be raised about whether or not we are the same person as we were, say, 7 years ago, when all of our atoms were, all of the cells in our body were completely different because cells regenerate and degrade? How can there be a sort of gap in our existence? At what point do we ever stop being the person 7 years ago and start being the person who's now got completely new set of cells?
So there are lots of different routes you can kind of go down with this, whether you're going down the mental side or the physical side, or going down both. But speaking purely physically, with like regeneration of cells. There's a classic example which I think you get introduced to in every single year if you study philosophy at Glasgow, called Theseus's ship. And Theseus's ship goes on a journey, and throughout, I am romanticising a little bit, and throughout his journey there are lots of storms and little bits of ship come apart, and so they go to a port and get replacement, and so, I don't know, maybe one of the sails has come off, get replacement sail, travel again, another storm hits, the bow gets broken, next port, and so gradually over time parts of the ship are replaced, and it's the same question of whether or not the ship at the end of their journey is the same as Theseus' ship, despite everyone having been on board, people remembering being on board Theseus' ship, it being called the same thing, and it having all of the same qualities as the previous one. But some people, there's like an argument of whether it's like exactly the same or whether it's just a version of the original one. And with humans, that's kind of the same thing. You could say that you're just, there's this idea of if you're like a worm who's just traveling through time and space and gradually developing over time. And some people like that idea, but some people would just be like, no, you're just like you're a stage, you're your present stage, and you are the sum of all of your cells in this present moment, and it kind of doesn't matter what you are, what you were, or what you will be. So those are some different ways of kind of thinking about it.
With regards to identity, you could say, so if you went to the teleporter, right, and you get blasted through the airwaves and you end up in, let's say, Dundee. Why? I cannot think of a more horrifying scenario. My brother lives in Dundee. I'm allowed to insult him. So you go through that. Are you the same person? In terms of social identity, I'd probably say yes, because you would use the same names for that object as it came in and came out. There's a continuity of events, you would say, taken as a whole. Whether that person was still the same person socially at any particular point along that journey is maybe not an appropriate question with regards to the concepts that are in use. So the one person has a consistent social identity across 80 years by virtue of being the same being, going through the same stage of events. But whether you're physically the same being, it's a slightly different question. That's identity in a different conceptual framework, you can say. And if you wanted to go that way, you can maybe say in terms of space-time, you were the set of all events that pertained to particular physical relations. That set is you, because there will only be one set of events which pertains between certain types of matter and certain types of relations. So even if the atoms did change, there would still be an overall consistency by virtue of them all belonging to the one set. But that's quite a complicated answer to get around to. Yeah, props.
So I'm gonna pick you up on that slightly. I'm gonna challenge it. Bold move for the second year philosophy student to challenge the PhD student.
I've just got a beard and hair. I don't really know what I'm talking about.
That's where you keep the knowledge.
Yeah, the cardigan will get bigger over the years until I'm authority.
So say we are these long series of events, but we do have like degradation of cells and a regeneration of cells. But we do to some extent have that mental continuity that kind of consolidates us as us. What happens if we were to lose that then? What would we do in that situation? Because say for whatever reason I was to then get amnesia, would I not then be a separate person of whom separate events are happening to me? Because physically I am completely distinct from the person I was 7 years ago. And now mentally, on an identity level, I am the same person. I've completely changed. All memories I had, all experiences I've had no longer exist. So how could we then be just a series of events if there are fundamentally two distinct people there?
So if you come back to the concept of different logical categories of identity, you would be able to describe the one set of events as either having consistency of physical identity, social identity, or personal identity. You could think of it that way. So the being that has amnesia is discontinuous in terms of personal identity. They're two different people. But from a social perspective, everyone else would say, look, that's Pete, he went in the teleporter to Dundee. They would be able to point you out. So in terms of social identity, there would be a sort of continuity because they would tell the story. Quite a lot of this probably would function in terms of like a narrative, if you think of it that way. So you're like, here's Pete. Pete had amnesia. Pete is now Dave. That works as a story, but that structure ties all those events together and therefore allows you to identify the continuity of identity across it. You can see the switching point, so you can, in your head, go like that. Okay, figure it out. That's what that is. That would be my answer. But this is not my area. I bought a book on it and I've not read it.
But then surely human identity is not as cut and dry as that sort of thing. So if we'll take more modern advancements in technology, this is a question from the audience. We have developed like more capacity to have kind of like weird sci-fi things almost happen to us. We have pacemakers that can keep people alive when they otherwise would have died, and that is just technology, and that is essentially a form of cybernetics. I have a friend that for whatever reason stuck a magnet in their finger, and now they can feel magnetic waves. At what point then would that person, I know it's a wild decision, but it's very cool.
They stuck it in their finger.
It's a very low budget magneto.
Yeah.
In any case, at what point would, through all of these replacements and all of these advanced cybernetics, since technology is currently always progressing, would that person stop being a person and start being an artificial intelligence or a robot? How many bits of my brain do I need to replace before I stop being Jarrod and start being whatever comes next?
Yeah, you go for this, Keir.
I think that Adam's kind of distinction on like logical categories of identity already encapsulated it. So, you can stick magnets in your fingers all you like. That's really no different from you losing skin. You've got like numerical identity, which is like 5 equals 5, and 5 just equals 5. They're the and a square has 4 sides. Like it just will be. But then this other like qualitative or like a social identity, if you talk to about, which is like they're different things. Like I can have a pencil here and a pencil there that is like identical in almost every single way. In any practical situation, I could use this pencil or that pencil, but they're numerically different. They're not the same pencil, but they are qualitatively equivalent. And so the story that you tell about this pencil, as it either breaks or you put magnets in the rubber bit, and you can put more and more AI functions, replace your limbs, as long as the qualitative story that you're telling about that individual, both from their own perspective and from the perspective of the people who they're sharing space and time with, is that is still Pete, who's had a really difficult time as he's gone up to Dundee and has become half robot. Then I think that you can say, for all intents and purposes, pragmatically, it's still Pete. I know it raises like a lot of like smaller issues, but that would be my stance on it.
See, it's a similar thing. People, whenever they bring up the whole sort of cybernetics thing, think of it this way. We might go, well, Pete's had his legs replaced with robotic raptor legs, and he's had his arms replaced with eagle wings, right? And you go, right, no worries. Pete's having a rough time up in Dundee. But they would go, well, is Pete still Pete? You would have no problem thinking Pete was still Pete when he was the quadruple amputee on the operating theatre board. You don't think, oh, he's lost his legs and arms, he's no longer Pete. You think, oh no, something has happened to Pete. Not, oh no, Pete isn't Pete. It's because of the way we use language. These slippages can often create problems where there's not really problems. It's feel like, oh, you've changed. So yeah, but that's not really the thing. I'm still me. You still identify me as me. That's distinct.
I also think that why this whole question is important really is because it's like if you have a consistent identity, you can hold obligations to other people, or people are obliged to hold things to you. And if you change, you're a completely different person, then you can get away with things. So that wasn't me that did that. I didn't do that. It wasn't me. And so Pete's pals might be like, it's not Pete anymore. He's got wings. But the person that Pete owes £1,000, still Pete.
Yeah.
Like, that is it. He still has the obligation to pay the money that he borrowed for the wings to that person. And so I think that there are different contexts of where personal identity continues in terms of what obligations, or even like moral or financial or really any sort of obligations you'd like, still apply to that individual.
So this is really annoying. I cannot remember what it's called. But there's a film. It's set during the English Civil War. And this woman's husband has like been away for 15 years due to the political events, and he comes back and they settle down to married life. Then this other man turns up and he says, no, I'm your husband. That man that turned up isn't. So then they have this big trial trying to discern whether or not she committed adultery because she fully believed that it was her husband. So that sort of fits into those identity questions. And perception of mind that we think of. I can't remember the name of this film, but it's very good. Good idea. But these identity questions often think that they fit into that sort of idea. Socially speaking, her obligations alter depending on the identity of that person in that particular social framework and things like that. So as Keir was saying, I mean, that was almost like a sort of vain pat in the back when I go, as Keir was saying when he said I was right. Yeah.
If that happens, so let's imagine that happens in the transporter case. So like I get in Glasgow, get into the transporter, and then I want to go to France, but a glitch happens and I end up in Germany as well. And I happen to have one sibling I was going to visit in France, and one of them actually lives in Germany as well. And they both think that they're chatting to me. Which one is me if I have obligations to both? Say I owe the one who's in France money and the other one I owe a high five, which she feels really strongly about. Am I then obliged, or which one is me to start with? Do I still actually have these obligations? Is the version of me who went into the booth in Glasgow, did that stop existing? But the ones in France and Germany who still have all my memories, exact copy and paste of my cells and everything, like how does that work with the links to obligations as well?
See, it's interesting because the one that's in France wouldn't perceive a mistake has happened. So the one in France wouldn't have the crisis until such times as they came aware of the German. So don't know, I'd be interested. I mean, if it was in terms of does the French or the German one pay the gas bill, I think they would charge you both. I think they would cover their bases. If you ever want a real clear answer in practical political philosophy, whatever the tax man would tax you, they have an answer.
I think that the difference for me there is we talked a lot about like physical identity being of some degree of import into continuous personal identity, but there actually memory identity I think becomes of importance, because the two clones could be absolutely physically identical, but the moment that one appears in Germany and one appears in France, they do not have the same memories. And I think that if you think that memory is a relevant factor in personal identity, then they just become two different people. And then the question is, when you come back to Scotland, who gets to go to bed with their wife? Like that's when that argument comes in, and I can't answer that. Only the wife can, I guess.
Well, basically, what we've come down to is, if you want an answer, ask someone's partner or the tax authority.
That is
either of those.
answer for you.
They will give you the answer you seek.
after an hour of discussing philosophy, the answer we've come down to is you should always either ask your partner or the taxman for any philosophical question.
Anything. Don't tell them they're wrong.
Thank God I was really struggling for dissertation ideas for fourth year. I think that is the last of the questions that I can see on the Slido. And I think that this has been an extremely interesting discussion wherein I am relatively hopeful for a future wherein I can see Pete going to pay off his bookie with raptor legs and pterodactyl wings. Just as we wrap up here, I'm going to ask the panelists to plug any sort of events that they would that are coming in Phil Thought's future before I do the same for the Dialectic Society.
So if you haven't checked us out already, if you haven't checked us out already, you can find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube as well, and YouTube. And I'm just looking up to see which episodes are coming out next, but we've got some really exciting stuff coming up anyway. We've got some on Underdetermination, which Keir and I did with possibly one of the coolest people I've ever met. Really cool. And he makes you question the existence of electrons, which is quite fun.
Shout out to JB, the ex-Mormon Buddhist physicist, professor of time travel in University of California, Irvine. Check out that episode.
Really cool. We've also just had an episode come out on miracles and the philosophy behind them, which is really, really interesting. And we've got some past episodes as well of some favourites of the department, like Robert Cowan and James Humphreys and Neil McDonnell, and they're all really great, so do have a listen. And follow us on social media, please.
Yeah. Thank you all for listening.